Have you ever been handed a burden that turned out to be a blessing? A weight you were forced to carry, only to find it was the one thing that could steady you against the wind? The world is full of such strange transactions, of debts paid in flesh and futures traded for a fistful of silver. Out here, in the vast and lonely quiet of the West, a man's soul can get as parched as the land itself. He can forget the sound of his own voice, forget the shape of a gentle hand. He can become a ghost haunting the landscape of his own life. This is the story of such a man named Caleb, whose world was as wide as the sky and as empty as a prayer no one was listening to. He was a mountain of a man, with hands calloused from work and a silence carved deep into his bones. He moved through the world with a deliberate quiet, as if afraid the sound of his own footfalls might break something fragile. And one night, in the smoke-choked air of a saloon where sin was the only currency with any real value, he played a hand of poker that would irrevocably alter the landscape of his soul. Across from him sat a man named Finnegan, a weasel in a waistcoat, whose eyes held the glint of polished rot. When his money ran dry, Finnegan pushed a tattered leather folio onto the table. Their contracts, he sneered, good for another 2 years. All three of Caleb's cards felt like stones in his hand. He didn't want a prize. But as he looked past Finnegan to the 3 shadows huddled by the door, 3 young women from a land of silk and dragons, treated like cattle at auction, he knew he had to play. He saw the cold terror in their eyes, the defiant tilt of a chin, the trembling of a hand. He won the pot not with a shout of victory, but with the grim finality of a judge passing sentence. And in that moment, Caleb, a man who owned nothing but his land and his loneliness, became the unwilling master of 3 human lives. The ride back to his homestead was a study in silence, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from fear and shame. Caleb rode ahead, his broad back a wall of intimidation he could do nothing about. He felt their eyes on him, 3 pairs of dark, assessing stares that pricked at his conscience. They were a whisper of silken sorrow against the rugged backdrop of the plains. He could feel their mistrust radiating like heat off the sun-scorched earth. The world out here was stark and unforgiving, a place that swallowed small, fragile things whole. For them, it must have looked like the end of the world. Caleb's mind was a maelstrom. He wasn't a man like Finnegan. The thought of owning another person was a bitter bile in his throat. He had won them to save them, but what did that mean? He had taken them from a cage only to lead them to his own remote patch of dirt, a place of profound isolation. Was one cage better than another? At the halfway point, he stopped by a small creek, dismounting with a slow, deliberate grace meant to be non-threatening. He filled a canteen and offered it to the woman who seemed to be their leader, the one with eyes that held an old, weary wisdom. Her name, though he did not know it, was Mai. She stared at the canteen as if it were a coiled snake, then slowly shook her head. The one beside her, a girl with a gaze as sharp and brittle as obsidian, Xiao, spat softly on the ground. The third, Lian, whose gentle face seemed a canvas for every sorrow in the world, simply shrank behind the others. Caleb retracted his hand, the simple gesture of offering water feeling like a profound failure. He drank, his throat tight, the cool liquid doing nothing to wash away the dust of his dishonor. They would not take even water from him. The long mile stretched on, each hoofbeat a hammer blow of condemnation against the anvil of the silent, judging land. His homestead was not a palace. It was a testament to solitude, a small, sturdy cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, a barn, and a corral, all huddled together against the vast indifference of the prairie. It was neat, orderly, and profoundly empty. Caleb didn't lead them to his front door. Instead, he took them to the small line cabin 100 yards away, a place he used for storage and shelter during harsh winters. It was humble, but it was separate. It was theirs. He unlatched the door and stepped back, a clear gesture for them to enter. He watched as they hesitated, then moved as one, a tight, defensive unit, disappearing into the shadows of the cabin. He took their worn luggage and set it on the porch, careful not to cross the threshold. Then he retreated to his own house, feeling the weight of their gaze through the wood of the door. An hour later, he returned, leaving a bucket of fresh well water, a sack of flour, and a parcel of smoked meat on their porch. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply provided, then walked away. Inside the cabin, the three women finally breathed. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and old wood. Xiao paced the small space like a caged wolf. "We must run," she hissed in her own tongue. Tonight Mai, ever the anchor, shook her head, her voice low and steady. "Run where? Into that?" "We would be dead in 2 days." Lian, huddled on a small cot, wrapped her arms around herself. "He has not hurt us," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Yet," Xiao countered, "they are all the same." "This one is just quieter." Mai moved to the single window, peering out at the man's cabin. She saw his silhouette, a lonely shape against the warm glow of his lamp. He was not like Finnegan. He was bigger, stronger, yet he had given them space. He had offered them water. He had left them food. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was an absence of cruelty that felt like a foreign country. "We will not run," Mai declared, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We will watch. We will wait. And we will be ready." The days bled into one another, marked only by the slow, deliberate march of the sun across the immense sky. A silent rhythm was established, a careful dance of avoidance and observation. Caleb would rise before dawn, his work on the homestead a constant, grounding force. He mended fences, tended to his few cattle, and tilled a patch of land for his own meager garden. He never approached their cabin. Supplies appeared on their porch as if by magic, the bolt of sturdy calico, jars of preserves from his larder, a bar of soap. Each was a quiet offering, a wordless apology. He was a constant, steady presence at the edge of their world, a mountain that cast a long shadow but never moved to crush them. From their window, the women watched him. They saw the gentleness with which he handled a newborn calf, the patience with which he coaxed a stubborn post into the hard ground. They saw him alone on his porch at dusk, staring out at the horizon, the loneliness clinging to him like his own shadow. Slowly, cautiously, they began to inhabit their small space. They cleaned the cabin until it shone. Using a spade Caleb had left nearby, they broke the tough earth behind their cabin and started a small garden, planting the few precious seeds they had carried with them from their old life. It was an act of defiance, a claim on the future. One morning, a new object appeared on the porch rail. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its form rough but its intention clear. Lian, the gentlest of the three, was the one who dared to pick it up. She ran a finger over the knife marks, her expression unreadable. Xiao scoffed, calling it a child's toy. But Mai saw it for what it was, a message. A man who carves a bird is not a man who breaks a wing. Caleb watched from his barn as Lian took the carving inside. He felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it as hope. The quiet equilibrium of the homestead was disrupted by the arrival of dust and laughter. Caleb's brothers, Aaron and Owen, rode in for their biannual visit, bringing with them the noise and energy of the outside world. Aaron was the elder, a man cut from the same quiet cloth as Caleb, his face etched with a past sorrow that mirrored his brother's. Owen was the opposite, all easy smiles and charming banter, his eyes sparkling with a relentless light. Their arrival was a test. Caleb explained the situation in clipped, sparse sentences, the shame a hot brand on his tongue. Aaron listened with a solemn nod, his gaze drifting to the women's cabin with a deep, empathetic sadness. Owen's reaction was different, his curiosity was immediate and unguarded. He saw not a burden, but a mystery. "Well now, brother," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "You always did bring home the strays." The brother's presence changed the delicate ecosystem. Owen, irrepressible and good-natured, made it his mission to break the silence. He'd sit on the fence, strumming a beat-up guitar, singing nonsensical songs. He'd leave wildflowers on their porch. He was met with Xiao's stony glares, which only seemed to encourage him. One afternoon, as the women worked in their flourishing garden, Owen leaned over the small fence they'd built. "That's a fine-looking patch of earth," he said to Xiao. Almost as pretty as its gardeners, he expected silence, a glare. Instead, Xiao stood up, wiping dirt from her hands, and fixed him with her fiery gaze. "You talk too much," she said, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. Owen was so stunned he nearly fell off the fence. A slow, delighted grin spread across his face. From the porch of the main cabin, Caleb watched the exchange, a rare, small smile touching his own lips. The ice wasn't just cracking, a piece had just been chipped away with defiant force. The first sign of winter came early, a sudden, vicious frost that descended overnight, coating the world in a brittle layer of silver. The women's garden, their small kingdom of green hope, was in peril. They worked with a desperate urgency as the cold evening air fell, throwing their own thin blankets over the fragile plants. From his porch, Caleb watched them, a knot tightening in his stomach. He saw their frantic movements, their losing battle against the encroaching cold. Their struggle was a reflection of his own, a constant fight against the harsh elements of the world. He didn't think, he acted. He went into his cabin and pulled out thick wool blankets, worn and smelling of cedar, the ones his mother had made. He walked over to their garden, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. He didn't speak, didn't try to take over. He simply approached the largest plant, a sprawling tomato vine heavy with green fruit, and held out a corner of a blanket. He looked at Mai, a silent question in his eyes. For a long moment, she hesitated, her breath misting in the frigid air. Then, she reached out and took the other corner. Their fingers brushed. The contact was a jolt, a spark of warmth in the freezing air, more potent than any words they could have exchanged. They worked together, a silent, efficient team, covering the precious plants as the last light of day bled from the sky. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of this shared task, this simple, profound act of preservation. The next morning, the ground was white, but the plants were safe beneath their woolen armor. On the porch of their cabin sat a single, perfectly ripe red tomato, salvaged from the frost. Mai picked it up, its skin smooth and warm from the morning sun, and knew it was a promise. The larder was getting low. A trip to town was unavoidable, a journey Caleb dreaded. The town of redemption was a place of narrow minds and long memories, a place where a man like him, living alone, was already a subject of gossip. The addition of 3 foreign women to his homestead would be like throwing gasoline on a fire. He approached their cabin, hesitating before knocking softly on the door frame. Mai answered, her expression guarded. Using slow gestures, Caleb mined writing on his palm and pointed towards the town on the horizon. He was asking if they needed anything. It was the first time he had ever initiated such a direct exchange. After a moment, Mai nodded and disappeared inside, returning with a scrap of paper. On it, in careful, elegant script, were 3 words, thread. Seeds. Salt in town, the air was thick with judgment. He felt the eyes on him as he tethered his horse outside the general store. Inside, the whispers were barely concealed. The final confrontation came in the form of Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her venomous tongue. She cornered him by the flour barrels, her face a mask of sanctimonious concern. "Caleb," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The whole town is talking. It is not right, a man like you, keeping those heathens." Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The anger that rose in him was cold and ancient. He looked down at the small woman, and his voice, when it came, was low and steady, as unshakable as the mountains. "They are not being kept," he said, each word a carefully placed stone. "They are under my protection." He held her gaze until she looked away, flustered and defeated. The words echoed in the sudden silence of the store. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for the town, but for himself. He was no longer their unwilling master. He was their protector. The long ride home felt shorter, his back a little straighter. Winter arrived in earnest, burying the homestead in a deep, silent blanket of snow. The world shrank, the vast prairie becoming an intimate space defined by the 2 small cabins and the path worn between them. It was during this period of intense isolation that Leanne fell ill. A fever took hold of her, leaving her shivering and weak, her gentle spirit dimmed. Mai and Xiao did their best, but their knowledge was limited, and their fear was a palpable thing in the small, cold cabin. They kept the fire roaring, but the cold seemed to be coming from inside Leanne. Caleb noticed the change. He saw the frantic energy from the cabin diminish, saw the smoke from their chimney dwindle to a weak grey wisp. A deep sense of foreboding settled over him. After a day of watching and waiting, he could bear it no longer. He approached their door, his heart a heavy drum in his chest. He knocked, and when Mai opened it, her face etched with panic, he saw Leanne on the cot, pale and trembling. For the first time, he crossed their threshold. The women flinched at his size in the small room, but desperation overrode their fear. Mai, her voice tight, allowed him to approach. He knelt by Leanne's side, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle as he felt her forehead. He recognized the fever, the rattling cough. He knew the remedy his mother had used, a poultice of yarrow and mint. He spoke in a low, calm voice, explaining through gestures and simple words what needed to be done. He guided Mai's hands, showing her how to crush the dried herbs and mix them with hot water. He didn't take over, he taught. He stayed through the long, dark night, a silent sentinel in the corner of the room, keeping the fire fed and the kettle full. He was a looming presence, but one of steadfast support. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in hues of pink and grey, Leanne's fever broke. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, looked at Caleb not with fear, but with a weak, grateful smile. In healing her, he had begun to heal something broken in all of them. Spring returned to the land with a shy, tentative beauty. The snow melted, revealing the dark, rich earth, and the creek began to sing its song again. The homestead was transformed, not just by the season, but by the life within it. The silence was no longer heavy, it was comfortable. It was often punctuated now by the sound of women's voices, sometimes even laughter, a sound as welcome as the birdsong. A new dynamic had settled over them all. Owen's charming persistence had worn down Xiao's defenses, their relationship evolving into a lively dance of witty retorts and shared smiles. He was teaching her English, and she was teaching him patience. They were a spark of light against the often somber backdrop. The connection between Caleb and Mai had deepened into a profound, unspoken understanding. They often worked in parallel, he in his fields, she in her garden, the space between them filled with a quiet respect that was beginning to feel like something more. One evening, the air soft and fragrant with the smell of damp earth, Caleb sat on his porch, a knife and a piece of wood in his hands. He was so absorbed in his work he didn't hear Mai approach until she was standing at the bottom of his steps. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there, watching him. Then, in her clear, quiet voice, she asked, "What are you making?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked him. He stopped carving and looked up, his heart giving a small, sharp jolt. He held out the piece of wood. It was a flower, a dogwood blossom, each petal carved with an astonishing delicacy that belied his rough hands. "For your garden," he said, his voice a little husky. She looked from the flower to his face, and a soft smile touched her lips. She didn't take it. Instead, she looked out at the two cabins, at the thriving garden, at the whole of their small world. "This is our home now," she said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a declaration. A quiet, powerful climax to their long, silent journey. He reached out and gently placed the wooden flower into her open palm. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over the homestead, a place no longer defined by solitude but by a vibrant, unconventional tapestry of lives woven together. It was a picture of peace, of a hard-won harmony. Owen and Xiao were mending a fence together, their bickering a familiar and affectionate soundtrack to the afternoon. He'd hand her a nail, she'd criticize his hammering, and they'd both fail to hide their smiles. Aaron sat on the porch of the main cabin, a book in his lap, a quiet contentment on his face. He had found a sort of healing in their strange family, his own wounded spirit soothed by the gentle rhythms of their lives. Down by the creek, where the water tumbled over smooth stones, Caleb and Mai walked together. The silence between them was a living thing now, full of comfort and shared history. Caleb stopped and picked up a flat, grey stone, turning it over in his palm. He finally began to speak, the words coming slowly, painfully, as he told her of the past that had hollowed him out, a fire, a mistake, a loss for which he had unjustly carried the blame his entire adult life. He spoke of the guilt that had kept him isolated, that had made him believe he was unworthy of companionship. He laid his soul bare for her, the ultimate act of trust. Mai listened without interruption, her dark eyes filled with a deep, unwavering compassion. When he finished, his voice raw with unshed tears, she didn't offer empty platitudes or words of forgiveness. Instead, she reached out and placed her small, warm hand on his forearm. It was a simple gesture, but it held everything: acceptance, understanding, and the promise of a shared future. It was absolution. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a survivor he had protected, but a partner who had saved him. They were a family, forged in the crucible of mistrust and nurtured by patient kindness. They were home.